Vienna, Austria, 1938. The city that once waltzed to Mozart now marched to a different rhythm, the rhythm of jackboots on cobblestone. The Anschluss had swallowed Austria whole, and the swastika flew where the double-headed eagle once soared. In the grand homes of the Nazi elite, a new aristocracy was being groomed. Children raised to worship the Führer as a god, to see brutality as strength, and to believe that an entire people deserved extinction. But in one of these homes, something impossible was happening. While the SS commander father discussed final solutions over schnapps in the parlor, his own children were upstairs learning songs that could get them all killed. Songs about freedom, songs about resistance, songs that mocked everything their father stood for. And the woman teaching them? She was just the nanny, a nobody, a young woman who should have been invisible, forgettable, safe. Instead, she turned those children into tiny weapons of defiance, right under the nose of a man who could have her executed with a single phone call. This is the story they buried. This is the story of the babysitter who waged war with lullabies. Before the Nazi machine consumed her city, Maria Kutschera was nothing special in the eyes of the regime. 22 years old, a novice nun who had left the abbey, hired to care for 7 children in the home of Captain Georg von Trapp, a decorated Austrian naval officer who had served the empire with distinction. The von Trapp household was not yet a Nazi stronghold when Maria arrived, but the walls were closing in. Georg von Trapp despised the Nazis with every fiber of his being. He had refused to fly their flag. He had turned down a command in their navy. He had become a problem, a wealthy, influential problem they were watching closely. His children, meanwhile, were growing up in a house of whispers and fear, where the wrong word at the wrong time could mean the end of everything. Maria saw it all. She saw the tension in Georg's jaw when Nazi officials came calling. She saw the children's confusion as their world changed overnight, and she made a decision that would have terrified anyone with an ounce of self-preservation. She would not let these children become what the Reich wanted them to be. The von Trapp children were not born rebels. They were born into privilege, into a world where obedience was expected and conformity was survival. But Maria did not teach them to conform. She taught them to sing. Not the propaganda anthems that echoed through every school and Hitler Youth rally, but the folk songs of Austria, the songs of the mountains and the valleys, the songs that celebrated a country that no longer officially existed. She taught them harmonies that predated the Führer. She taught them lyrics that spoke of freedom, of defiance, of a world where goodness mattered more than power. And she did it knowing that every single performance was a risk, because Georg von Trapp, despite his hatred for the Nazis, was still connected to their world. Nazi officers visited his home, they drank his wine, they sat in his chairs, and Maria made sure those children sang for them. The first time it happened, it must have felt like watching a bomb tick down to zero. High-ranking Nazi officials seated in the von Trapp salon, expecting an evening of pleasantries, perhaps some classical music to soothe their egos after a long day of oppression. Instead, they got 7 children, lined up like a choir of angels, singing songs that had been carefully chosen by Maria, songs that on the surface seemed innocent enough, songs about Edelweiss, about the Austrian countryside, about home and heritage. But to anyone truly listening, anyone who understood the subtext, these were not just songs, these were acts of resistance. Edelweiss was not a Nazi flower, it was Austrian. It represented a country that was supposed to have disappeared, swallowed whole by the Third Reich. Every note those children sang was a rejection of the regime. Every harmony was a middle finger to the men who thought they owned the future. And Maria stood there, calm as a summer morning, watching her small army of singers deliver their payload of defiance directly into the ears of the enemy. The danger was not theoretical. This was not a game. Austria, under Nazi rule, was a place where children informed on their parents, where neighbors vanished in the night, where the wrong joke could earn you a ticket to Dachau. The Gestapo had files on everyone, and the von Trapp family was already on their radar. Georg's refusal to cooperate had marked him as unreliable, a potential traitor. Maria's presence in the household was noted. Her background, her movements, her influence over the children, all of it documented in the meticulous records of a regime that trusted no one. And yet, She continued. She taught those children to sing louder. She taught them songs that grew bolder. She turned the Von Trapp home into a quiet, melodic rebellion, a sanctuary where the future of Austria was not erased, but sung into existence by the voices of 7 children who had no idea they were risking everything. What Maria Kuchera did in that house was not just brave, it was borderline suicidal. She was a young woman with no power, no protection, no escape plan. She was standing in the home of a man the Nazis wanted to control, teaching his children to resist in the most visible, audible way possible. And when those children sang their anti-Nazi songs in front of the very men who could destroy them all, Maria was making a bet. She was betting that the innocence of children, the beauty of music, and the arrogance of evil would create just enough cover for her act of defiance to survive. She was betting that the truth, sung in harmony, could slip past the guards. And for a while, against all odds, she won that bet. But the Reich was patient, and they were watching. The Von Trapp household existed in a strange duality, a place where 2 incompatible realities tried to occupy the same space. On one side stood Georg von Trapp, a man carved from old-world principles, honor and duty etched into his very bones. He had commanded submarines for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, had earned medals for bravery, had lost his first wife and been left to raise 7 children alone in a world that no longer made sense to him. The Anschluss had been his breaking point. When Hitler annexed Austria in March of 1938, when the crowds cheered and the swastikas unfurled across Vienna like a disease, Georg von Trapp made his position clear. He would not serve the Third Reich. He would not fly their flag. He would not pretend that the rape of his country was liberation. This defiance made him dangerous. The Nazis did not tolerate resistance from men of influence, and Georg von Trapp had both wealth and reputation. They wanted him, they needed him. A decorated naval hero pledging allegiance to Hitler would be worth 1,000 propaganda posters. But Georg refused to bend, and that refusal turned his home into a pressure cooker. Into this tinderbox walked Maria, a force of nature disguised as a nanny. She had come from the Abbey, from a life of prayer and silence, and she brought with her an energy that the Von Trapp children had never experienced. She was not stern, she was not distant, she was alive in a way that defied the grey, suffocating atmosphere of Nazi-occupied Austria. She climbed trees with the children. She ran through the gardens. She laughed loud and unashamed in a city where laughter had become a suspicious act. But more than that, she saw what was happening to these kids. She saw them being slowly crushed under the weight of fear and uncertainty. Their father was withdrawn, consumed by his hatred for the regime and his inability to fight it. Their country was gone, replaced by something monstrous. And Maria understood that if she did nothing, these children would either be broken by the Reich or absorbed into it. So she gave them the one weapon she had: music. Not as entertainment, not as distraction, but as resistance. The songs Maria taught were carefully chosen, each one a small act of insurgency wrapped in melody. She started with the folk music of Austria, the songs that had been sung in the mountains and valleys for generations, songs that predated borders and dictators and death camps. These were not just nostalgic tunes. In 1938 Austria, they were contraband. The Nazis wanted to erase Austrian identity, to replace it with pan-Germanic loyalty to the Führer. Singing about Austria, celebrating its landscapes and heritage, was an implicit rejection of that erasure. Maria knew this. She also knew that music had a unique power to slip past defenses. A song could say what a speech could not. A melody could carry a message that a manifesto would get you killed for writing, and children singing were the perfect delivery system. Who would suspect 7 kids, their voices pure and angelic, of undermining the Third Reich? Maria was counting on that underestimation. She was weaponizing innocence. The performances began small, family gatherings where the children would sing for their father and a few trusted friends. But as word spread about the Von Trapp children's musical talent, the audience changed. Nazi officers, hungry for culture and eager to curry favor with the wealthy Von Trapp family, started appearing at the house. They came expecting entertainment, a pleasant evening of music from well-bred children. They got something else entirely. Maria would stand in the corner, her face a mask of calm, while the children sang songs that praised Austria, that spoke of freedom, that subtly mocked the very foundations of Nazi ideology. The officers, often too arrogant or too ignorant to catch the subtext, would applaud politely, completely unaware that they had just been insulted by a choir of kids. It was a high-wire act. One misstep, one officer who actually understood what he was hearing, and the entire Von Trapp family could be arrested, Maria included. But she kept pushing, kept teaching, kept turning those 7 children into a tiny, melodic rebellion. The risk escalated with every performance. The Gestapo was everywhere, listening, watching, taking notes. Denunciations were common. A neighbor with a grudge could report you for humming the wrong tune. Children were encouraged to inform on their parents if they heard anti-Nazi sentiment at home. The Von Trapp household was already under scrutiny because of Georg's refusal to cooperate with the regime. Adding Maria's musical resistance to that equation was like pouring gasoline on a fire. But Maria seemed almost fearless, or perhaps she simply understood that fear was a luxury she could not afford. These children needed to know that their country, their identity, their humanity still existed even if the Nazis said otherwise. And if teaching them to sing about Edelweiss and Alpine meadows was an act of treason, then Maria was willing to commit treason. Every single day. The incident that changed everything happened on a warm summer evening in 1939, just months before the world would explode into total war. The Von Trapp villa had been commandeered, not by force, but by the insidious politeness of Nazi power, for a gathering of high-ranking officials. Gauleiter, SS officers, men whose signatures sent thousands to camps, now sat in Georg's drawing room drinking his wine and pretending this was a social call. It was not. This was an inspection. The Reich wanted to see if Georg von Trapp could be brought to heel, if his wealth and influence could be harnessed for the cause. They had offered him a commission in the Kriegsmarine, a position of honor in Hitler's navy. Georg had not yet given his final answer, and the Nazis were growing impatient. The evening was designed to apply pressure, to remind him of what he had to lose, his home, his children, his life. And in the middle of this tense, civilized threat, Maria made her move. She told the children they would perform tonight, for these men, and she chose the most dangerous repertoire she had ever assembled. The children lined up in the salon, 7 stair-step figures in their finest clothes, looking for all the world like the perfect Aryan family the Reich loved to parade in its propaganda. The Nazi officers settled into their chairs, smug and expectant, ready to be charmed by the innocence of youth. Georg stood in the corner, his face unreadable, but his hands clenched into fists. He knew Maria. He knew she was not about to deliver some harmless performance. She had been escalating for months, pushing boundaries, testing limits, and now she was about to push in front of the most dangerous audience imaginable. The room fell silent. Maria gave a slight nod, and the children began to sing. The first song was innocent enough, a traditional Austrian melody that drew polite smiles from the officers. But then came the second song, and the third, each one more pointed than the last. Songs about the Austrian mountains, about freedom, about a homeland that was not Germany. Songs that used coded language, double meanings, lyrics that on the surface seemed patriotic, but were actually mourning the death of Austria. The officers began to shift in their seats. Some frowned, others leaned forward, trying to decipher what they were hearing. And Maria stood there, her face serene, watching her tiny army deliver their payload. Then came the crescendo, the moment that could have ended with all of them in handcuffs. The children sang Edelweiss, not yet the famous version that would later be immortalized, but an Austrian folk arrangement that Maria had taught them, one that explicitly celebrated Austria's national flower, a symbol that the Nazis had tried to suppress because it represented Austrian identity separate from the Reich. Every word was a declaration. Every note was defiance. Edelweiss, Edelweiss, bless my homeland forever. The lyrics were not subtle. They were a prayer for a country that Hitler said no longer existed, and the children sang it directly to the men who had erased that country. The tension in the room was suffocating. One of the SS officers, a man with cold eyes and a scar across his cheek, stood abruptly. He stared at Maria. He stared at Georg. For a moment it seemed certain that he would speak, that he would call this what it was, treason. But he did not. Instead, he clapped. Slowly, and the others, confused, uncertain, followed his lead. The performance was over. Maria had won. Barely. That night, after the officers had left and the house was finally quiet, Georg confronted Maria, not with anger, but with something close to awe and terror. He asked her if she understood what she had just done, if she realized how close they had all come to disaster. Maria's response was simple. She told him that the children needed to know who they were, that they needed to understand that their country, their heritage, their souls were not the property of the Third Reich. She told him that if they did not resist, even in small ways, even in ways that seemed foolish or dangerous, then the Nazis had already won. Georg had no counter-argument. He knew she was right. But he also knew that right and wrong meant nothing to the regime outside his door. The Gestapo did not care about moral victories. They cared about obedience. And the Von Trapp family had just announced, in four-part harmony, that they would never obey. The reports began almost immediately. Neighbors who had attended the gathering whispered to friends. Friends whispered to officials. Officials opened files. Within a week, the Gestapo had updated the Von Trapp dossier. Maria's name appeared in the margins. The children's performance was noted. The song selection was analyzed. And a recommendation was made. Watch them closely. The net was tightening. The Reich was patient, methodical, and utterly without mercy. Maria had gambled that beauty and innocence could shield them, but the Nazis had seen through prettier disguises. The clock was ticking, and Georg von Trapp knew that his next decision would determine whether his family lived or died. The invitation arrived 3 days later, delivered by a young officer in an immaculate uniform who smiled too much and stayed too long. It was addressed to Captain Georg von Trapp, typed on official Reich stationery, and the language was polite to the point of menace. The Kriegsmarine requested the honor of his presence at a ceremony in Berlin, where he would formally accept his commission and pledge his loyalty to the Führer. The date was set. The expectations were clear. This was not an invitation, it was an ultimatum. Georg held the letter in his hands and felt the walls of his world collapse inward. If he went to Berlin, he would become a Nazi. If he refused, he would become a target. There was no third option, no diplomatic escape, no polite way to decline service to a regime that did not accept refusal. Maria watched him read the letter, saw the color drain from his face, and understood immediately what it meant. They were out of time. The singing, the small acts of resistance, the illusion that they could survive by simply staying quiet, all of it was over. The Reich had made its move. Now the Von Trapps had to make theirs. Georg called a family meeting that night, something he had never done before. The children sat in a row, confused and frightened by the gravity in their father's voice. Maria stood beside them, her presence a quiet reassurance. Georg did not sugarcoat the situation. He told them that the Nazis wanted him to join their navy, to become part of their war machine, to help them conquer and destroy. He told them that he would rather die than serve Hitler, and then he told them the truth that would change their lives forever. They were leaving Austria, not tomorrow, not next week, soon, as soon as they could arrange it without raising suspicion. The children stared at him in stunned silence. Leave Austria, leave their home, their friends, their entire world. Where would they go? How would they escape? Georg did not have all the answers yet, but he had the beginning of a plan. They would accept an invitation to perform at the Salzburg Festival, a major musical competition that would give them a legitimate reason to travel. And from Salzburg, they would disappear, cross the border into Switzerland or Italy, vanish before the Gestapo could stop them. It was dangerous, it was desperate, but it was the only chance they had. Maria understood her role in this escape before Georg even said it. The children needed to be ready, not just physically but mentally. They needed to believe they could do this, that they could walk away from everything they knew and survive. So she did what she always did. She taught them to sing. But now the songs had a different purpose. They were not just acts of defiance. They were rehearsals for freedom. Every performance, every note, every harmony they practiced was preparation for the moment when they would stand on a stage in Salzburg, smile for the Nazi officials in the audience, and then run for their lives. Maria drilled them relentlessly. She made them perfect, because perfection was their cover. The Reich expected excellence from the von Trapp children. They had to deliver it, right up until the moment they betrayed everything the Reich stood for. The irony was not lost on Maria. She was using the Nazis' own propaganda, their love of Aryan perfection and cultural superiority, as a weapon against them. The more beautiful the children sang, the more untouchable they seemed, the easier it would be to slip away. But the Gestapo was not stupid. They had been watching the von Trapp family for months, and Georg's sudden acceptance of the Salzburg festival invitation raised immediate red flags. Why now? Why, after refusing every other public appearance, was he suddenly eager to put his children on stage? An officer was assigned to the case, a man named Zeller, cold and efficient, who made it his mission to ensure that Georg von Trapp did not slip through their fingers. Zeller began appearing at the von Trapp villa unannounced, asking questions, observing rehearsals, inserting himself into their lives with the casual cruelty of a man who held all the power. He watched Maria teach the children. He watched Georg's every move. And he made it clear, without ever saying it directly, that he knew something was wrong. The pressure was unbearable. Every day felt like walking on a tightrope over an abyss. One wrong word, one suspicious action, and the entire escape plan would collapse. Maria had to keep the children calm, keep them focused, keep them singing as if their lives were not hanging by a thread. Because they were. The night before they were scheduled to leave for Salzburg, Maria could not sleep. She lay in her small room staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that could go wrong. The border guards who might stop them. The Gestapo agents who might be waiting. The children who might panic or make a mistake. She thought about Georg, a man who had already lost so much, now risking everything on a desperate gamble, and she thought about herself, a young woman who had come to this house to care for children, and had somehow ended up at the center of an escape plot that could get them all killed. She was terrified, but she was also certain. This was the right thing to do. The only thing to do. Because the alternative was watching those 7 children grow up under the swastika, learning to hate, learning to obey, losing every piece of themselves that made them human. Maria would not let that happen, even if it cost her everything, even if they failed. She would fight for their freedom until her last breath. Tomorrow, the performance. Tomorrow, the escape. Tomorrow, everything would change. Salzburg in the summer of 1939 was a city caught between two worlds. On one hand, it was still the birthplace of Mozart, a place of culture and beauty, where music filled the air, and tourists wandered cobblestone streets, marveling at Baroque architecture. On the other hand, it was a Nazi stronghold, swastikas hanging from every public building, soldiers patrolling the squares, and the Gestapo watching everyone and everything with the cold efficiency of a machine designed to crush dissent. The Salzburg Festival had become a propaganda tool, a showcase for Aryan excellence where the Reich could parade its cultural superiority before the world. Families competed for the honor of performing, knowing that success could mean favor with the regime, protection, opportunity. The von Trapps were scheduled to perform on the final night, and their arrival in the city did not go unnoticed. Georg von Trapp, the naval hero who had refused to serve, now bringing his children to sing for the Führer's entertainment. It was suspicious. It was noted. And Zeller, the Gestapo officer assigned to their case, made sure he had a front row seat. The von Trapp family checked into their hotel under the watchful eyes of party officials and undercover agents who blended into the crowds like wolves in sheep's clothing. Georg moved through the motions with mechanical precision, shaking hands, smiling when required, playing the role of the compliant Austrian aristocrat who had finally seen the light. But inside he was calculating. Every exit, every route, every possible contingency. Maria, meanwhile, kept the children occupied, rehearsing in their hotel suite, keeping their voices sharp and their minds focused. She could see the fear in their eyes, the way the oldest ones understood that something was deeply wrong, that this performance was not like the others. But she also saw their trust in her, their belief that if Maria said everything would be all right, then it would be. That trust was a weight she carried like an anchor. She could not fail them. She could not let her fear show. So she smiled, corrected their harmonies, and told them they were going to be magnificent. And she prayed silently and desperately that they would all live long enough to sing again. The day of the performance arrived with agonizing slowness. The festival grounds were packed with officials, their uniforms a sea of black and red, their faces rigid with the self-importance of men who believed they were building a 1,000-year empire. The Von Trapp children waited backstage, their costumes perfect, their hair brushed, their faces pale but composed. Maria stood with them, her hand resting on the shoulder of the youngest, a little girl who clutched a doll and tried very hard not to cry. Georg was somewhere in the audience, forced to sit among the Nazi elite, forced to smile and nod, while his heart hammered in his chest. The plan was simple, or as simple as any plan to escape the Third Reich could be. They would perform. They would be brilliant. They would receive their applause. And then, during the chaos of the post-performance celebrations, they would slip away. A car was waiting, a driver who owed Georg a favor, a route through the mountains that avoided the main checkpoints. It was insane. It relied on luck, timing, and the arrogance of the Nazis to assume that no one would dare defy them so publicly. But it was all they had. The lights dimmed. The audience fell silent. An announcer introduced the Von Trapp family singers, and the children walked onto the stage, their faces glowing under the spotlights, their voices ready. Maria watched from the wings, her fists clenched so tightly her nails drew blood. This was it. The performance that would either save them or destroy them. The children began to sing, and the sound was transcendent. Every note was perfect, every harmony locked in with a precision that came from months of drilling, from Maria's relentless preparation. They sang Austrian folk songs, melodies that celebrated the mountains and valleys of a country the Nazis claimed no longer existed, and the audience, packed with the very men who had erased Austria, applauded wildly. They heard beauty. They heard excellence. They heard proof of Aryan superiority. They did not hear the quiet, desperate act of rebellion embedded in every word. The children sang about Edelweiss, about home, about a world where love mattered more than power. And the Nazis clapped, because they were too arrogant, too blinded by their own mythology, to understand that they were being mocked by 7 kids and a nanny who had turned music into a weapon. Then came the final song, the one Maria had saved for last. A hauntingly beautiful piece that spoke of farewells, of leaving behind the past, of journeys into the unknown. The children's voices swelled, filling the hall with a sound so pure it seemed to transcend the ugliness of the regime that surrounded them. Tears streamed down the faces of some in the audience, moved by the performance, completely unaware of its true meaning. This was not just a song, it was a goodbye, a farewell to Austria, a farewell to the life these children had known. And as the final note hung in the air, as the audience erupted in applause, Maria knew the next 60 seconds would determine everything. The children bowed, they smiled. They walked off stage into the wings where Maria grabbed them, her voice low and urgent, telling them to move, to follow her, to trust her. Georg was already there, having slipped out of his seat during the applause. The family converged in a backstage hallway, and without a word they ran. Not to the front entrance where officials and cameras waited, but to a side door, a servant's exit, a crack in the Nazi fortress through which 7 children, 1 man, and 1 impossibly brave young woman were about to attempt the impossible. The car was waiting exactly where it was supposed to be, a black sedan with its engine already running, driven by a man named Franz, who had served under Georg in the Navy and owed him a debt he could never repay. Franz did not ask questions. He saw the fear in their eyes, the way Maria ushered the children into the vehicle with frantic urgency, the way Georg kept glancing over his shoulder at the festival hall where, at any moment, someone would notice they were missing. The doors slammed shut. Franz hit the accelerator, and the Von Trapp family disappeared into the Salzburg night, leaving behind the applause, the awards, the entire carefully constructed facade of their performance. Inside the car, no one spoke. The children were crammed together, 3 in the back seat, 4 in the rear compartment, their breathing shallow and rapid. Maria sat in the front passenger seat, her rosary wrapped around her fingers, her lips moving in silent prayer. Georg stared out the window, watching the city lights fade behind them, knowing that every second they remained in Austria brought them closer to capture. The plan was to drive south toward the mountains, to reach the border crossing near Innsbruck before dawn, before the Gestapo realized what had happened and locked down every exit from the country. It was a 3-hour drive under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. They made it exactly 47 minutes before they hit the first checkpoint. A wooden barrier across the road, 2 soldiers with rifles, a small guard station with a light burning in the window. Franz slowed the car, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, and Georg reached over to squeeze Maria's hand, a gesture that said everything words could not. This was the moment. If the soldiers had been alerted, if Zeller had already discovered their absence and issued orders, then this roadblock would be the end. The family would be dragged from the car, arrested, separated. Georg would disappear into a camp. Maria would be executed as a conspirator. The children would be placed in Nazi youth programs, their minds scrubbed clean of everything their nanny had taught them. The car rolled to a stop. A soldier approached, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, his face young and bored. He tapped on the window. Franz rolled it down, his voice steady as he handed over their papers. The soldier glanced at the documents, then shone his light into the back seat, where the children sat frozen, their eyes wide with terror. For an eternal second, the soldier just stared. Then he looked at Georg, recognition flickering across his face. Captain von Trapp, the naval hero, the man every Austrian had once admired. The soldier's expression shifted, confusion giving way to something else, something that might have been respect or sympathy, or simply exhaustion with the regime he served. He handed the papers back. He waved them through. The barrier lifted, and the car accelerated into the night, leaving the checkpoint behind. But the relief was short-lived. 30 kilometers later, they hit another roadblock, then another. The Nazis had established a network of checkpoints across Austria, a web designed to catch anyone trying to flee. Each time, Georg and Maria held their breath, waiting for the soldier who would recognize them, who would ask the wrong questions, who would make the phone call that would end everything. Each time they somehow passed through. Georg's reputation as a war hero carried weight, even among the Nazis who despised him. The children's innocent faces, their exhaustion, their obvious vulnerability, created a narrative that most soldiers accepted without question. A family traveling home late from the festival, nothing suspicious, nothing worth investigating. But Georg knew their luck could not hold forever. Somewhere behind them in Salzburg, Zeller would have discovered their absence by now. The Gestapo would be mobilizing. Alerts would be going out to every border crossing, every train station, every port. The net was closing and they were still hours from safety. The mountains loomed ahead, dark silhouettes against a sky just beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Franz pushed the car harder, the engine straining as they climbed narrow roads that wound through alpine passes. The children had fallen into an uneasy sleep, their bodies pressed together for warmth and comfort. Maria had stopped praying and started watching the road, her eyes scanning for headlights, for soldiers, for any sign that they had been discovered. Georg sat in silence, his jaw clenched, his mind running through contingencies. If they were stopped now, if the soldiers at the next checkpoint had orders to detain them, he would fight. He would give Maria and the children time to run, to disappear into the mountains, to find another way across the border. He would sacrifice himself without hesitation, because that was what fathers did. That was what men of honor did. Even when honor had become a crime in the country they once loved. The border crossing appeared just as the sun broke over the peaks, a small station nestled in a valley where Austria ended and Switzerland began. It looked almost peaceful, a single guardhouse, a barrier painted red and white, a Swiss flag hanging limp in the still morning air. But between the von Trapps and that flag were Austrian soldiers, Nazi officers, and the final checkpoint they would have to pass. Georg turned to Maria, and in that moment, without words, they understood each other completely. This was where it ended, one way or another. Either they would cross into Switzerland and freedom, or they would be arrested and dragged back to face the consequences of their defiance. There was no middle ground, no negotiation, no second chance. Franz stopped the car at the Austrian side of the border. An officer approached, older than the others they had encountered, his uniform decorated with ribbons, his face hard and suspicious. He did not look like a man who would let anyone pass without thorough inspection. He looked like a man who enjoyed his job, and Georg von Trapp knew with absolute certainty that the next 5 minutes would determine whether his children lived or died. The officer's name tag read Gruber, and his eyes were the kind of grey that looked like frozen steel. He took the papers from Franz with deliberate slowness, studying each document as if searching for microscopic flaws, his expression revealing nothing. Behind him, 2 younger soldiers stood at attention, their hands resting on their rifle straps, their bodies tense with the possibility of action. Gruber walked around the car, his boots crunching on gravel, peering into the windows at the sleeping children, at Maria's pale face, at Georg's controlled expression. He returned to the driver's side and leaned down, his voice low and measured. He asked where they were going, why they were traveling so early. Why Captain von Trapp, a man who had refused every Nazi overture, was suddenly crossing into Switzerland with his entire family and no luggage. The questions hung in the air like guillotine blades. Franz opened his mouth to answer, but Georg interrupted, his voice calm and authoritative, the voice of a man accustomed to command. He told Gruber they were attending a family wedding in Zurich, a private affair, and they had left directly from the festival to make the mourning ceremony. It was a lie delivered with absolute conviction, and for a moment it seemed like it might work. But Gruber was not convinced. He stepped back and gestured to his subordinates, speaking in rapid German that made Maria's blood run cold. They were to search the vehicle, check for contraband, verify identities. The younger soldiers moved forward, and Georg's hand instinctively moved toward the door handle, his body coiling for action. Maria saw it and reached back, placing her hand on his arm, a silent plea for restraint. If Georg fought now, if he gave them any excuse, they would all be shot before they took 3 steps. The soldiers opened the rear door, and the children woke with gasps of confusion and fear. One of the soldiers began pulling them out, lining them up beside the car, their small bodies shivering in the cold mountain air. The oldest girl, almost 14, looked at Maria with eyes that begged for reassurance, for some sign that this nightmare would end. Maria forced herself to smile, to nod, to project a calm she absolutely did not feel. Inside, she was screaming. Inside, she was calculating how to grab the children and run into the forest, knowing it was suicide, knowing they would be hunted down within hours. Gruber walked down the line of children, studying each face with clinical detachment. He stopped at the youngest, the little girl who still clutched her doll, her bottom lip trembling as she tried not to cry. Gruber knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with her, and asked in a voice that was almost gentle what her name was. The girl whispered her answer, so quietly it was barely audible. Gruber asked her another question. Where had they been tonight? The girl looked at Maria, uncertain, afraid of giving the wrong answer. Maria nodded encouragement, and the girl told him they had been singing at the festival, that they had performed for lots of people, that everyone had clapped. Gruber's expression changed, something shifting behind those grey eyes. He stood up and turned to Georg, asking if these were the von Trapp family singers, the ones who had won the folk music category just hours ago. Georg confirmed it, wondering where this line of questioning was leading, if it was a trap or something else entirely. Gruber was silent for a long moment, then he said something that made Georg's heart skip. He said he had been at the festival. He had heard them sing. The world seemed to stop. Maria felt her legs go weak. This was it. Gruber had been there. He had heard the songs, the Austrian folk melodies, the Edelweiss tribute, all of it. He knew what those songs meant. He understood the subtext that Maria had embedded in every note, and now he stood between them and freedom, holding all the power, deciding in real time whether to arrest them or let them pass. Gruber looked at Maria, really looked at her for the first time, and she saw something in his face that she had not expected. Recognition, not of her identity but of what she had done. This officer, this Nazi in his pristine uniform with his ribbons and his authority, understood that Maria had turned those children into weapons of resistance. He knew. And Maria braced herself for the order to arrest them all, for the end of everything. But instead Gruber turned to his subordinates and told them to stand down. He handed the papers back to Franz. He told them the search was complete. And then, in a voice so quiet that only Georg and Maria could hear, he said something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. He said that his own daughter had been in the audience last night. He said she had cried during their performance. He said it was the first time in months that he had seen her remember what Austria used to be. Gruber stepped back and signaled to the guards at the barrier. The red and white pole lifted into the air, and beyond it, just 50 meters away, was Switzerland. Freedom, survival, the impossible made real. Franz did not wait for permission. He drove forward slowly, the car passing under the barrier, crossing from Nazi Austria into neutral territory. Maria turned in her seat, looking back at Gruber, who stood motionless on the Austrian side, watching them go. She would never know what happened to him after that moment, whether his mercy cost him everything, or whether he simply returned to his post and continued serving a regime he might have secretly despised. But she would never forget the look on his face, the exhaustion, the grief, the quiet recognition that sometimes, even in the darkest moments, humanity could flicker to life in the most unexpected places. The car crossed into Switzerland, and the von Trapp family, against all odds, was free. The Swiss border guards were polite, almost indifferent, stamping their papers with bureaucratic efficiency and waving them through without questions or suspicion. It was such a stark contrast to the interrogation they had just survived that it felt surreal, like stepping from one reality into another. Franz drove another 20 kilometers before pulling off the road into a small clearing surrounded by pine trees. He turned off the engine, and for the first time in hours, in days, in months, the von Trapp family allowed themselves to breathe. The children tumbled out of the car, their legs stiff from the cramped journey, their faces pale but alive with the dawning realization that they had escaped. The youngest began to cry, not from fear but from the overwhelming release of tension. The oldest pulled her siblings into a tight huddle, holding them as if she could shield them from everything they had just experienced. Maria stepped out into the cool mountain air and collapsed against the side of the car, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. She had held it together through the checkpoints, through the interrogation, through the impossible moment when Gruber could have ended them all. But now, in safety, the weight of what they had done crashed down on her like an avalanche. Georg walked over and placed his hand on her shoulder, his own voice cracking as he thanked her, not just for the escape, but for everything that had led to this moment, for teaching his children to resist, for giving them the courage to run, for being the kind of person who would risk her own life to save theirs. But the celebration was short-lived. They were safe from immediate arrest, but they were also homeless, penniless, and utterly without a plan. Georg had been forced to leave everything behind, his estate, his wealth, his entire life's accumulation of property and possessions, all of it now property of the Third Reich. The Nazis would seize it within days, adding the von Trapp fortune to their war chest. Georg had exactly 60 Swiss francs in his pocket, money Franz had given him before they crossed the border. It was enough for a few nights in a cheap hotel, perhaps some food. But then what? They could not return to Austria. The Gestapo would be hunting them, and anyone who helped them would face severe consequences. Georg's name would be on every wanted list in the Reich. Maria too would be marked as a fugitive, a conspirator in the escape of a high-value target. The children, despite their innocence, would be considered stolen property, to be recovered and re-educated. Switzerland offered temporary refuge, but it was not home, and the world outside was rapidly running out of safe places. Maria gathered the children and did what she always did in moments of crisis. She made them sing. Right there in a forest clearing in the Swiss Alps, with no audience but the trees and the sky, she had them perform one of the Austrian folk songs they had sung at the festival. Their voices were shaky at first, raw with exhaustion and emotion, but they found their harmonies locked into the rhythms that Maria had drilled into them over months of preparation. And as they sang, something remarkable happened. The fear began to fade. The children stopped crying, their voices grew stronger, more confident, filling the forest with a sound that was defiant and beautiful and utterly unbroken. This was Maria's final lesson, the one she had been teaching them all along without saying it explicitly. No matter what was taken from them, no matter what they lost or where they ended up, they still had this, their voices, their music, their identity. The Nazis could steal their home, their country, their possessions, but they could not steal this, and as long as they could sing, they were free. Georg listened to his children and understood, perhaps for the first time, the full magnitude of what Maria had given them. She had not just taught them songs, she had taught them resistance. She had shown them that power, no matter how absolute it seemed, could not control everything. That beauty and art and simple human dignity were weapons that tyrants could never fully suppress. The Nazis had tried to own Austria, to reshape it into an extension of their grotesque empire. But these 7 children, singing in a forest about Edelweiss and mountains and a country that refused to die, were proof that the Reich had failed. Austria lived in their voices, and it would continue to live no matter how far they ran or how long they stayed in exile. Maria had turned them into carriers of memory, guardians of a truth that the Nazis desperately wanted to erase. And in doing so, she had won a victory far greater than any military conquest. The family spent the next 3 weeks in Switzerland, moving from town to town, staying in modest accommodations, surviving on the charity of strangers and the remnants of Georg's reputation. Word of their escape spread quietly through anti-Nazi networks, and offers of help began to arrive. A sympathetic priest arranged temporary housing. A former colleague of Georg's secured false documents. An American impresario, having heard about the Von Trapp family singers from festival attendees, sent a telegram with an astonishing proposal. He wanted to bring them to the United States, to tour, to perform, to share their music with audiences who would pay to hear it. It was an opportunity born from desperation and luck in equal measure. Georg accepted immediately. Within a month, the Von Trapp family boarded a ship in Italy bound for New York, carrying nothing but their voices and the clothes on their backs. Maria stood on the deck as Europe disappeared behind them, knowing they might never return, knowing that the world they had known was gone forever. But she also knew that they had survived. Against impossible odds, against the full might of the Third Reich, 7 children and 1 stubborn nanny had escaped, and they had done it by singing. America in 1939 was a country still clawing its way out of the Great Depression, a nation where most people had never heard of the Von Trapps and could not locate Austria on a map. The family arrived in New York Harbor with almost nothing, their false documents barely passing inspection, their accents thick and unfamiliar to immigration officials who processed them with the same indifferent efficiency they showed to all European refugees flooding into the country. Georg, who had commanded submarines and moved in the highest circles of Austrian society, now stood in line at Ellis Island clutching a battered suitcase, trying to explain to a bored clerk that yes, they were musicians, and no, they did not have contracts or sponsors, or any real plan beyond survival. The American impresario who had promised them work was nowhere to be found. His telegram had been genuine, but his interest had evaporated when he learned they spoke almost no English and had no experience performing outside of Austria. The Von Trapps were stranded in a foreign country with less than $20 to their name, 7 children to feed, and no clear path forward. It was Maria who refused to let despair take hold. She found a Catholic church in Manhattan, spoke with the priest in broken English mixed with Latin, and secured temporary shelter in a boarding house run by nuns who took pity on the refugee family with the beautiful singing voices. The first American performance was a disaster. A small church basement in Queens, an audience of perhaps 30 people, mostly elderly parishioners who had come for the free concert and stayed out of politeness. The Von Trapps sang their Austrian folk songs with the same precision and passion they had brought to the Salzburg festival, but the audience sat in confused silence. They did not understand the language. They did not recognize the melodies. They did not grasp the historical and emotional weight of songs about Edelweiss and alpine meadows, and a country that no longer existed. When the performance ended, the applause was tepid, obligatory, the sound of people who appreciated the effort but felt no connection to the content. Georg was devastated. Maria was furious, not at the audience but at herself, for not anticipating this. She had been so focused on escape, on survival, that she had not considered what would come after. The songs that had been weapons of resistance in Austria were simply foreign noise in America. They needed to adapt. They needed to learn English, to understand their new audience, to find a way to make their music relevant to people who had never lived under Nazi occupation and could not comprehend what it meant to sing in defiance of tyranny. So they started over. Maria bought a used English grammar book from a second-hand store and began teaching herself and the children simultaneously, stumbling through pronunciations and conjugations late into the night while Georg searched desperately for paying work. They performed wherever anyone would have them: church basements, community centers, school auditoriums, nursing homes. The pay was minimal, sometimes nothing at all, just donations dropped into a hat passed around after the performance. But slowly, incrementally, they began to improve. They added American folk songs to their repertoire, learning She'll Be Coming Round the Mountain and Home on the Range with the same discipline Maria had once applied to Austrian resistance anthems. They learned to smile more, to engage with audiences, to tell their story in simple English that conveyed the drama of their escape without drowning listeners in historical detail. And gradually, word began to spread, not about their music, necessarily, but about their story. A family that had fled the Nazis, children who had sung their way to freedom, a nanny who had risked everything to save them. America loved that story. It was heroic, romantic, the kind of narrative that fit perfectly into the country's self-image as a refuge for the oppressed. By 1940, the Von Trapp family singers had a manager, a real one this time, who booked them into larger venues and secured radio appearances. They were no longer refugees scrambling for survival. They were performers, building an audience, earning a living through the same voices that had once mocked Nazi officers in a Viennese salon. The irony was not lost on Maria. She had taught these children to sing as an act of resistance against fascism, and now they were singing to earn money in a country that did not yet understand the threat fascism posed to the entire world. America in 1940 was still isolationist, still convinced that Europe's problems were Europe's problems, still unwilling to see that the fire consuming Austria and Poland and France would eventually reach across the Atlantic. Maria tried to tell their audiences about the reality of Nazi occupation, about the fear and the oppression and the casual cruelty of a regime that turned neighbors into informants and children into soldiers. But most Americans did not want to hear it. They wanted to hear the uplifting story. They wanted the happy ending. They wanted to believe that escape was possible, that good people could outsmart evil, that singing and courage could conquer tyranny. And so the Von Trapps gave them that story, even though Maria knew the real story was far darker and far from over. The family eventually settled in Vermont, buying a small farm with money saved from their performances, creating a new home in a place that looked almost like the Austrian Alps they had left behind. The children grew up American, attending local schools, learning to sound less foreign, adapting to a culture that was radically different from the one they had known. Maria married Georg in a quiet ceremony, formalizing the partnership that had saved them all, becoming not just the nanny, but the mother these children needed. And through it all, they continued to sing. Not for survival anymore, but because it was who they were. The music had carried them out of Austria. It had sustained them through exile, and it would define them for the rest of their lives. But Maria never forgot why she had taught them to sing in the first place. It was not entertainment. It was not a career. It was resistance. It was the refusal to be silenced, to be broken, to accept that evil had the final word. And even in the safety of America, even decades after escaping the Reich, Maria understood that the lesson she had taught those 7 children in a Viennese villa was eternal. The lesson that your voice, your identity, your humanity were things no tyrant could ever truly take away. Maria Augusta Kutschera von Trapp died in 1987 at the age of 82, surrounded by the family she had saved and the legacy she had built. By then, her story had been sanitized, romanticized, and transformed into one of the most successful musicals in history. The sound of music had turned her into a Hollywood character, a singing nun who twirled on mountaintops and taught children to be free through the power of song. Millions of people around the world knew her name, but almost none of them knew the real story. They did not know about the Nazi officers she had deliberately provoked. They did not know about the songs she had weaponized, turning innocent melodies into acts of insurgency. They did not know about the terror of those checkpoint crossings, the moments when a single wrong word could have ended everything. The musical gave audiences a fairy tale, complete with romance and escape and a triumphant finale. But the truth was darker, more dangerous, and far more remarkable than any screenplay could capture. Maria had not saved the Von Trapp children through charm and musical numbers. She had saved them through calculated defiance, through a willingness to risk her own life repeatedly, and through the understanding that sometimes the most powerful weapon against fascism is simply refusing to let it erase who you are. The real legacy of Maria's resistance was not the fame or the fortune or the Hollywood adaptations. It was the lesson she embedded in those 7 children, a lesson that rippled outward through generations. Resist, always. Even when resistance seems futile, even when the cost is unbearable, even when the smartest, safest choice is to stay silent and survive. Maria could have been a quiet nanny, keeping her head down, teaching the children to obey, helping them adapt to life under Nazi rule. She would have been safe, she would have been comfortable, she would have been complicit. Instead, she chose danger. She chose to teach children that their voices mattered, that their heritage was worth defending, that collaboration with evil was not an option, no matter how powerful that evil seemed. And when the moment came to run, when the Reich finally closed its grip and demanded total submission, those children were ready. Not because they were brave by nature, but because Maria had trained them to be brave, note by note, song by song, performance by performance. She had given them armor made of music, and it had saved their lives. What makes Maria's story so crucial today is not its uniqueness but its universality. She was not a soldier. She was not a spy. She was not a politician or a general or anyone with institutional power. She was a 22-year-old woman with no resources except her conviction and her creativity. And she found a way to fight back against one of history's most brutal regimes using the tools she had available. Her story is a reminder that resistance does not always look like armed rebellion. Sometimes it looks like a nanny teaching children to sing the wrong songs. Sometimes it looks like small acts of defiance that accumulate over time, building toward a moment when escape becomes possible. The Nazis wanted to control everything, to regulate thought and speech and identity itself. Maria's response was to prove that control was an illusion. She turned the children of a Nazi target into walking contradictions of everything the Reich stood for, and she did it right under their noses. That took more courage than most people will ever be asked to demonstrate in their entire lives. The story of Maria and the Von Trapps has been told and retold so many times that it has become mythology, a feel-good tale that gets trotted out whenever people need to believe in happy endings. But stripping away the Hollywood gloss reveals something far more valuable. It reveals a blueprint for resistance in impossible circumstances. It shows that you do not need weapons or armies to fight fascism. You need conviction. You need creativity. You need a willingness to risk everything for what matters. Maria had all three, and she deployed them with precision and relentless determination. She saw children being poisoned by propaganda and decided she would be the antidote. She saw a regime that demanded silence and decided to fill the air with song. She saw a family about to be consumed by evil and decided to become their lifeline. And when the moment came to cash in all those small acts of resistance, to turn defiance into escape, she did not hesitate. She grabbed those children and ran, trusting that the foundation she had built would hold. And it did. The real tragedy is how close this story came to being forgotten entirely. If the Von Trapps had not escaped, if that final border crossing had ended differently, Maria would have been another nameless victim, another file in a Gestapo archive, another person erased by the machinery of genocide. Her resistance would have died with her, known only to the children she tried to save and the officers who executed her. But she made it. They all made it. And because they survived, because they lived to tell the story even in its sanitized form, we know that resistance is possible. We know that ordinary people can stand against extraordinary evil and win. Not always, not easily, but sometimes, and sometimes is enough to matter. Maria Kutschera taught 7 children to sing anti-Nazi songs in the living room of a Nazi commander's ally, and those children lived to sing in freedom for the rest of their lives. That is not a fairy tale. That is a war story, and it is one we should never allow ourselves to forget, especially now. Especially as the world once again flirts with the ideologies Maria spent her life fighting. Her voice is silent, but the voices she trained, the legacy she built, the lessons she taught, those echo still. Resist, always, with whatever tools you have, because your voice, used correctly, can change everything.